A girl revealed to the billionaire that his wife was not dead. Secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe, leave a like, and comment where you are watching from. The morning fog of August lingered over Greenwood Cemetery like a thick, melancholic cloak, transforming the century-old maples into ghostly silhouettes that faded into the New York mist. Edward Montgomery walked slowly along the cobblestone paths, his footsteps echoing in the reverent silence of that sacred place. His hands trembled slightly, not from the biting cold of the winter morning, but from the emotion that always overwhelmed him during these ritual visits that had been taking place every Saturday for exactly 2 years. At 45, Edward carried the weight of a business empire he had built from scratch, but also the invisible scars of a loss he had never managed to overcome. Tall, with graying hair at his temples and deep brown eyes that reflected a constant sadness, he was known in New York not only for his wealth, but for the generosity with which he managed 3 large charitable institutions. His hands, always impeccably cared for, delicately held a bouquet of white roses, Helen's favorite flowers. The black marble tomb shone even under the diffuse light of the grey morning. Engraved in golden letters, the words, "Helen Montgomery, beloved wife, dedicated mother," seemed to dance before his tear-blurred eyes. Edward knelt on the cold granite, placing the flowers with the same religious care as always, and closed his eyes to feel the subtle scent of jasmine that still seemed to emanate from there, the same fragrance Helen wore that lingered on all her silk dresses. "My love, here I am again," he murmured softly, his hoarse voice breaking slightly. "Isabel is doing well, you know. She's in her sophomore year at St. Mary's Academy now, getting excellent grades. She has your eyes, Helen, and your stubbornness too." A melancholic smile crossed his face as he adjusted the roses in the bronze vase. "Yesterday she asked why I never talk about you. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a teenager that her father still hasn't accepted that you are gone?" The cold wind rustled the leaves of the nearby maples, creating a constant whisper that seemed to respond to his intimate confessions. Edward always talked to Helen during these visits, sharing about business, about Isabel, about how the house felt empty without her crystal laughter echoing through the halls of the mansion on the Upper East Side. It was his sacred ritual, his way of keeping alive the connection that death had tried to sever. "Sometimes I wake up thinking that you are still there, lying beside me," he continued, his voice now a nearly inaudible whisper. "I reach out to find your silky hair, and reality hits me like a punch in the stomach. How could you have left, my love? How did I not realize you were suffering? What signs did I ignore?" It was then that the sepulchral silence was broken by the sound of small footsteps running irregularly over the gravel. Edward lifted his eyes, still blurred by tears, and saw a small, awkward figure running among the gravestones like a lost little ghost. It was a girl of about 8, with messy brown hair escaping from 2 poorly done braids, wearing a faded yellow dress that seemed twice as big for her skinny frame. The child ran oddly, occasionally stopping to touch some gravestones with her fingertips, as if she were reading something. Invisible etched in the stone, her large, expressive eyes seemed to search for something specific, and when they finally landed on Edward, she stopped abruptly, panting, her cheeks flushed from exertion. "Sir!" she shouted with all the strength of her small lungs, her high-pitched voice echoing among the graves and breaking the solemnity of the place. "Sir, your wife hasn't left. I know where she is." Edward felt as if the world had stopped spinning. His legs trembled violently, and he had to lean against the gravestone to avoid collapsing. His heart raced in his chest like a crazed drum, and for a moment he believed he was having a heart attack. The girl's words echoed in his mind like out-of-tune bells. "Your wife hasn't left." "What? What did you say?" he managed to stammer, his voice coming out as a hoarse croak. The girl took a few steps closer, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. She clutched a crumpled notebook to her chest, hugging it as if it were a precious treasure. "The lady you visit every week," she said, pointing to the tomb with a small, dirty finger. "She's not down there. I see her all the time, you know. She walks around the city, but now she's different. She wears simple clothes and helps the kids who don't have homes. I've drawn her many times." The girl quickly opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with detailed drawings made with colored pencils. Edward felt the world spin around him. He reached out a trembling hand to take the notebook, and when his eyes focused on the drawings, he nearly fainted. There, sketched with the innocent precision of a child, was Helen's face. Every detail of her arched eyebrow, the delicate curve of her nose, the smile he knew by heart. But there was something different about these portraits. Helen appeared dressed in simple clothes, surrounded by children, in settings he did not recognize. Where did you see her?" he asked, his voice almost a desperate whisper. "When was this?" "Yesterday," the girl replied with disconcerting nonchalance. "She was in the park near the church downtown, teaching a little girl how to make cloth dolls. I hid behind the big tree and watched. She smiles a lot now, you know. Before, when I saw her through the walls of the big house, she always seemed sad." Edward's mind went into complete panic. Big house. How did this child know? Was it her mansion? How did she know such intimate details about Helen? Was he going crazy? Could it be that the pain of loss was making him hallucinate, creating an imaginary child to bring him cruel hope? "Who are you, girl?" he asked, trying to control the tremor in his voice. "Where do you live? How do you know my wife?" The girl bit her lower lip, hesitating for the first time since she appeared. She looked around nervously, as if fearing someone might hear her. "I'm Carla," she finally murmured. "My mom works cleaning mansions. Sometimes I would play in the garden while she worked, and I would see the pretty lady through the windows. My mom always told me not to bother the employers, so I stayed quiet, just watching." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. He vaguely remembered Mrs. Constance, the southern worker who had worked in his home for years, always discreet and efficient. She had mentioned having a daughter, but he had never paid much attention. His obsession with control extended to the staff, but not to their families. "Carla," he said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the whirlwind of emotions overwhelming him, "I need you to tell me everything, every detail of what you saw. Can you do that for me?" The girl nodded vigorously, her eyes shining with a seriousness that seemed inappropriate for her age. "Of course, sir. But you promise you won't tell my mom? She doesn't know I see the lady, and you also promise you won't hurt her when you find her. She seems happy now." Edward felt tears welling up in his eyes again, but now they were tears of a desperate hope he hadn't dared to feel in 2 long years. "I promise, Carla, I promise." 3 weeks had passed since the disturbing encounter at the cemetery, and Edward couldn't think of anything else besides the words of that mysterious girl. Sitting in his office on the 18th floor of the commercial building on Fifth Avenue, he stared distractedly at the chaotic movement of the city through the tinted glass. But his mind was completely absorbed by Carla's revelations. The girl's drawings were spread out on his mahogany desk, each examined dozens of times with a magnifying glass, searching for any detail that could confirm or refute that impossible possibility. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his obsessive thoughts. "Mr. Montgomery," said the soft voice of his secretary, "Mrs. Constance is here. She said you asked to speak with her." Edward felt his heart race. In recent days, he had discreetly observed Constance during her tasks in the mansion, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The woman in her 50s, with slightly graying black hair always tied in a tight bun, carried a silent dignity that he had never properly appreciated. Her movements were precise and economical, her brown eyes always alert, as if she could perceive things that others ignored. "You can send her in," he replied, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. Constance entered the office cautiously, her hands, calloused from domestic work, nervously intertwined in front of her body. She wore the same impeccably pressed navy blue uniform as always, and her eyes showed genuine concern mixed with something Edward couldn't identify. Perhaps it was fear. "You called for me, Mr. Edward?" she asked in her soft southern accent, keeping a respectful distance from the desk. "Please have a seat, Constance," Edward said, gesturing to the leather armchair in front of his desk. "We need to talk about your daughter." The woman's face instantly paled, and she clenched her fists inside her uniform pockets. "Did Carla do something wrong, sir? I always told her not to bother you or Miss Isabel. If she—" "No," Edward gently interrupted, raising one hand. "She didn't do anything wrong. In fact, she told me something very important a few weeks ago. Something about Helen." The silence that followed was so thick that Edward could hear the ticking of the antique German clock hanging on the wall. Constance lowered her eyes, her hands trembling slightly, and when she finally raised her face, there were tears threatening to spill. "Mr. Edward," she murmured, her voice breaking, I need you to understand that my daughter is special. She sees things that other people don't see, remembers everything in minute detail. Sometimes that scares people." Edward leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. "Tell me about this specialty of hers, Constance. I need to understand." The woman took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal a secret kept for years. "Carla was born this way, sir. The doctors at the health clinic said she has a very developed photographic memory. She can draw places she has visited only once, remember conversations word for word, identify people she has only seen in passing." Constance paused, wiping a tear with the back of her hand. "But she has difficulty distinguishing between what is present and what is past sometimes. It's as if all the memories are happening at the same time in her little head." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. "And what exactly did she tell me about Helen? Did you know about this?" Constance hesitated for a long moment, her eyes avoiding direct contact with his. Finally, she sighed deeply and said, "Mr. Edward, my daughter has always liked Mrs. Helen very much. She would watch her through the windows of the house, fascinated by her kindness. When that happened, Carla became very confused. She doesn't quite understand the concept of death, you know. To her, people just change places." "Constance," Edward said, his voice firm but gentle, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Is your daughter imagining things, or is there any possibility that Helen is really alive somewhere?" The worker opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the office door bursting open. Isabel Montgomery, 16, entered like a whirlwind, her flowing brown hair and bright green eyes sparkling with indignation. She wore the uniform of St. Mary's Academy, a navy blue blazer, pleated skirt and knee-high socks, but had a rebellious expression that contrasted with the formality of her clothes. "Dad, I need to talk to you right now," she exclaimed, stopping abruptly upon noticing Constance's presence. "Oh, sorry, I didn't know anyone was here." "Isabel, we're in an important conversation," Edward said, trying to maintain his patience. "Can it wait a bit?" "No, Dad, it can't wait." Isabel crossed her arms over her chest, her stubbornness, so characteristic of Helen, manifesting in every line of her posture. "Something strange happened at school today, and it has to do with Mom." Edward and Constance exchanged a look filled with tension. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Isabel approached the table, pulling a yellowed envelope from her backpack. "I found this in my school locker. Someone put it there during recess. She extended the envelope to her father, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and fear. "Dad, there's a drawing inside that looks just like the embroidery Mum used to do on our clothes when I was little." Edward took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was ordinary, without any identification. But when he opened it and pulled out the contents, he nearly dropped everything on the floor. It was a delicate drawing made with colored pens, showing an intricate floral pattern, exactly the same design that Helen embroidered on Isabel's clothes when she was a child. On the back of the paper, there was a single word written in delicate handwriting: hope. "My God," Edward murmured, his voice barely audible. Constance stood up from her chair and approached, looking over his shoulder at the drawing. "Mr. Edward," she said, her voice heavy with emotion, "I need to tell you something. In the past few months, Carla has come home with drawings that she says she exchanged with a special friend. She never wanted to tell me who this friend was, but the drawings, they have the same style as this one." Isabel moved even closer, her eyes wide. "Dad, do you think, is it possible that Mom is really alive? That she's trying to communicate with us?" Edward felt the world spinning around him again. All the pieces of an impossible puzzle seemed to be fitting together in a way that defied any logic. Helen had been declared dead after a car accident on the highway, but the body was never found due to the heavy rains that swept the vehicle away into the river. The funeral had taken place with the casket closed, containing only a few personal belongings recovered from the accident site. "Constance," he said, his voice gaining a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to talk to Carla, now. Bring her here immediately." "But sir, she's at school." "Then let's go get her. Isabel, you're coming with us. I want to understand exactly what's happening here." 40 minutes later, the three were in the small two-room apartment where Constance lived with her daughter in the East Side neighborhood. The place was simple but impeccably clean, with basic furniture and walls decorated with dozens of colorful drawings, all made by Carla. The girl was sitting at the kitchen's laminate table doing her homework when they arrived. "Carla," Edward said, kneeling beside, I need you to show me all the drawings you've made recently, especially the ones you exchanged with your special friend." The girl looked at her mother for approval, and after a hesitant nod from Constance, she ran to the tiny room she shared with her. She returned carrying a shoebox filled with colorful papers. "Here are all of them," she said, dumping the contents of the box onto the table. "My special friend always leaves new drawings for me in places only I look. And when I leave one of my drawings for her, the next day there's always a new one in its place." Edward examined the drawings with growing disbelief. They were all made in the same delicate and detailed style that he recognized perfectly. There were portraits of children playing, urban landscapes, blooming flowers, all signed only with a small heart in the lower right corner, just like Helen used to sign her embroidery. "Carla," Isabel asked, her voice trembling with emotion, "where exactly do you find these drawings? And where do you leave yours?" The girl pointed out the apartment window. "In the park, right across the street, there's a big tree with a little hole in the trunk. It's our secret mailbox. Sometimes I also leave drawings on the bench near St. Mary's Church, and there are always replies." Edward felt tears welling up in his eyes again. St. Mary's Church was just 2 blocks from Greenwood Cemetery, where he visited Helen every Saturday. Could it be that, during all these months of mourning, she had been nearby, watching him, communicating through the innocent drawings of a special child? "Carla," he said, holding her small hands between his, "can you take me to that tree now? I want to see if there's a new drawing waiting for you." The girl smiled, her eyes shining with excitement. "Of course. Let's see if my special friend left any surprises today." The park in front of Constance's building was a small green oasis amidst the urban chaos of the East Side. Century-old trees provided shade for some concrete benches where elderly people played dominoes and mothers watched their children play in the weathered playground. Edward followed Carla with his heart racing, Isabel by his side, holding his hand tightly, while Constance walked a few steps behind, visibly nervous about the whole situation. Carla stopped, in front of a majestic yellow maple, her small hands feeling the rough trunk until she found a natural cavity at eye level. "Here," she exclaimed excitedly, "this is where our correspondence happens." Edward watched as the girl reached into the opening of the tree and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembled as she handed it to him. He handed over the drawing, and when he unfolded it, he felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. It was a delicate portrait of Isabel, but not Isabel as she was now, rather. As she had been at 10 years old, exactly as she appeared in a photo that Helen kept on her bedside table, which had disappeared after the accident. "Dad," whispered Isabel, looking over his shoulder, "this drawing, it's from when I was 10. I remember perfectly because I was wearing that floral dress that Mom made for my birthday. How could someone know that?" Constance approached, her eyes wide with surprise and something that seemed like fear. "Mr. Edward, I need to tell you one more thing. In the past few months, I've noticed that someone has been following Carla, not in a threatening way, you understand, but sometimes, when I go to pick her up from school, I see a woman from a distance watching her, a woman who wears simple clothes, a scarf on her head, but has a elegant posture, familiar." Edward felt the world spinning again. "Why didn't you tell me this before, Constance?" "Because I wasn't sure of anything, sir. And because—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Because I feared you would think I was making things up. You were already suffering so much." "Carla," said Edward, kneeling again beside the girl, "when you see your special friend, what is she wearing? Can you describe her to me?" The girl closed her eyes as if accessing a detailed mental file. "She always wears very simple clothes, dark jeans, a cotton top, worn sneakers. Sometimes she wears a colorful scarf tied around her neck. Her hair is different now, shorter and a darker color, but her eyes are the same, big and kind, honey-colored." Isabel let out a muffled sigh. Helen had exactly those honey-colored eyes, a unique trait she had inherited from her Italian grandmother. It was impossible for a child to invent such a specific detail if she hadn't truly seen Helen. "Where do you see her most often, Carla?" Edward asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "In various places. Sometimes at the Liberty Fair, helping an elderly Japanese woman who sells jewelry. Other times near the church downtown, playing with the children who live on the street. And once I saw her entering an old building in the West Side, carrying a bag full of brushes and paints." Edward and Isabel exchanged a meaningful glance. Helen had always been passionate about painting, keeping a small studio in the attic of the mansion where she spent hours creating canvases that she later donated to charity auctions. If she were truly alive, it made sense that she would be looking for a place to continue painting. "Carla," Edward said, his voice now firm and determined, "could you take us to that building in the West Side? Can you remember exactly where it is?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Of course. I remember everything. It's on a street named after a flower, near a bakery that smells of sweet bread." 2 hours later, the group stood in front of a 1940s townhouse on Rose Street, in the heart of the West Side. The building had 3 stories, with exposed brick facade and faded green wooden windows. On the ground floor was a small Portuguese bakery, from which the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked sweet bread wafted, just as Carla had mentioned. "This is it," she said, pointing to a side door that led to the upper floors. "She went up through this door, and I saw a light turn on in the second-floor window." Edward looked at the second-floor windows. They were closed with simple curtains, but one of them had a pot of red geraniums on the sill, exactly the type of flower that Helen cultivated in her private greenhouse at the mansion. Could it be just a coincidence? "Let's go up," he said, heading for the side door. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. The group climbed a narrow, creaking staircase, the smell of paint and varnish growing stronger with each step. On the second floor, there were 3 solid wood doors, all unmarked. Edward pressed his ear against the first door and heard the muffled sound of classical music, Chopin, the same piece that Helen used to play on the piano in the living room when she was focused on her artistic projects. His hands trembled as he slowly turned the doorknob, discovering that it was also unlocked. The door opened to reveal a small makeshift studio that took everyone's breath away. Canvases in various stages of completion were scattered across the walls, all painted with the delicate technique and vibrant colors that Edward recognized perfectly as being Helen's unique style. There were portraits of street children, urban landscapes of New York, seen through the eyes of someone who deeply loved the city, still lifes with wildflowers. In the center of the room, an improvised table made from an old door resting on sawhorses served as a workspace. Brushes of all sizes were organized in glass jars, paint tubes scattered with the same creative disarray that Helen always maintained in her studio at the mansion. The familiar smell of oil paint and solvent filled the air, mixed with a subtle perfume that Edward recognized immediately: jasmine. "My God," murmured Isabel, slowly walking through the space as if she were on sacred ground. "Dad, look at this." She was standing in front of a canvas that showed an aerial view of the family mansion, painted from a perspective that only someone who knew every detail of the property intimately could have created. Constance remained near the door, her hands nervously intertwined. "Mr. Edward, maybe we shouldn't be here. What if someone comes?" But Edward was completely absorbed in examining every brushstroke, every detail that confirmed his growing suspicions. In one corner of the studio, there was a small table with open sketchbooks, showing sketches that clearly served as studies for the larger paintings. And there, scattered among the sketches, were filled with dozens of small, colorful drawings, exactly like the ones Carla received in her secret correspondence. Carla ran to the drawing table, her eyes shining with recognition. "Look, Uncle Edward, these are the drawings from my special friend. She makes them here." It was then that Edward noticed something that made him stagger. On a small makeshift shelf, there was a simple framed photo. The same photo of Isabel at 10 years old that had disappeared from Helen's bedside table after the accident. Next to the photo was a small vase with fresh white roses, identical to the ones he brought to the cemetery every Saturday. "Isabel," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "your mother knows we visit her grave. She knows about the white roses." At that moment, the sound of slow footsteps coming up the stairs reached them. Edward felt the blood freeze in his veins. Someone was coming, and by the rhythm of the footsteps, slow, familiar, he had the terrible and wonderful sensation that he would finally discover the truth. Isabel grabbed his arm tightly. "Dad, what do we do?" Edward looked around the studio one last time, absorbing every detail that confirmed that Helen was alive, creating, rebuilding herself in silence. The footsteps on the stairs were closer now. "We stay," he said, his voice gaining a determination he hadn't felt in 2 years. "We stay and wait. It's time to understand what really happened to Helen." The footsteps on the stairs stopped abruptly, followed by a tense silence that seemed to last an eternity. Edward held his breath, his eyes fixed on the studio door, while Isabel squeezed his hand tightly enough to leave marks. Constance remained motionless near the entrance, and Carla, seemingly oblivious to the tension of the moment, continued examining the drawings scattered across the table. Then a feminine voice murmured something in Japanese from outside, followed by the sound of keys jingling. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door opened to reveal an Asian woman in her 60s, short and sturdy, wearing a simple navy blue kimono over jeans. Her grey hair was tied up in a traditional Japanese bun, and she carried a patterned fabric bag that smelled strongly of incense. The woman paused in the doorway upon seeing the group, her small, intelligent eyes quickly assessing the situation. She showed no surprise or alarm, only a weary resignation, as if she knew this moment would eventually come. "You are family," she said in slow but correct Portuguese, her voice carrying a soft Japanese accent. "I knew one day you would come looking." She entered the studio and closed the door behind her, carefully placing the bag on a wooden stool. Edward stepped forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ma'am, my name is Edward Montgomery. This is my daughter Isabel, and I believe you know Constance and her daughter Carla. We need to understand what this place means. Who is the artist that paints here?" The woman watched him for a long moment, her dark eyes studying every line of his face with a disconcerting intensity. Finally, she sighed deeply and said, "My name is Akiko Yamamoto. My family came to Brazil 3 generations ago, and I have been running a small handmade jewelry stall at the flea market for 40 years. She walked over to one of the canvases leaning against the wall, a moving portrait of a street child feeding pigeons in a park, and gazed at it with genuine admiration. "This artist came to my stall 8 months ago. She was too thin, wearing tattered clothes, but had the most delicate hands I had ever seen. I offered her work making handmade jewelry, but soon I discovered her true talent was in painting." Isabel approached, her hands visibly trembling. How does she look? Can you describe her?" Akiko smiled sadly. "A beautiful woman, even with short dyed black hair and simple clothes, honey-colored eyes that speak more than words, hands that create beauty where others see only pain." She paused, looking directly at Edward, hands that tremble when she talks about the family she left behind. Edward felt the world spinning once. Again. Does she talk about us?" "Not directly," Akiko replied, moving to the table where a small electric heater was set up, preparing green tea in tiny cups. "But a mother always talks about her children, even when she tries not to. She told me about a teenage daughter who plays the piano like an angel, and a husband who visits cemeteries with white roses." Constance stepped forward, her voice almost a whisper. "Ms. Akiko, where is she now? We need to see her. We need to understand why she did this to us." The Japanese lady served the tea in silence, her precise and ritualistic movements revealing the traditional education she had received. "She didn't do anything to you," she finally said, her voice heavy with a wisdom that came from decades of observing human nature. "She did something for you. There is a very important difference." "What do you mean by that?" Edward asked, accepting the small cup of tea she offered him. Akiko walked to the window and looked out at the bustling street below, where street vendors were setting up their stalls for the evening rush. "When Helen came to me, she was very confused. She couldn't clearly remember many things, mixed up names, got lost in streets she had known for years. But one thing she always repeated: I need to stay away until I can remember how to be a good mother and wife again." Isabel let out a muffled sob. Did she think she wasn't a good mother? "No, child," Akiko said gently, turning to her. She knew she was a good mother. The problem was that she couldn't remember how to show it. There were gaps in her memory, entire periods that simply vanished. She feared that returning home in this state could cause more confusion and pain for the people she loved. Edward placed the cup of tea on the table with trembling hands. Memory gaps? What kind of accident could cause that? Akiko hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much she could reveal. She told me about a fall. She said she was visiting one of the charities you support in the countryside and had an accident on the stairs of the building. She hit her head hard and was unconscious for hours. But that was 6 months before the car accident, Edward murmured, doing mental calculations. She never told me about any fall. Exactly, Akiko confirmed. She didn't tell you because she started to realize she was forgetting important things. Names of close people, birthdays, even familiar faces sometimes became unrecognizable to her. She was afraid you would notice and worry. Constance moved closer to the window, looking at the same view that Akiko had observed moments before. That's why she started to distance herself in the last few months. I noticed, but I thought it was marriage problems. She told me that the mental confusion was getting worse, Akiko continued, her voice heavy with compassion. Some mornings she would wake up not recognizing her own room. Other times she would look at family photos and couldn't remember when they were taken. The Japanese woman paused, wiping away a discreet tear. The car accident wasn't accidental, but it wasn't suicide either. It was a desperate escape from a mind she felt was slipping away. Edward sat heavily in a wooden chair, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a hammer. She staged her own death to protect herself, and to protect us, and to have time to heal, Akiko added. In the last few months, working with art, helping underprivileged children, her memory has gradually returned. It's as if each act of kindness reignited a part of her original personality. Carla, who had remained quiet examining the drawings, suddenly lifted her head and said, "That's why she gets more colorful every day. At first, when I saw her through the walls of the house, she was all grey and dark blue. Now she has yellow and pink when she plays with the children." Everyone turned to the girl, intrigued by her peculiar observation. Akiko smiled, approaching Carla with genuine interest. "Do you see colors in people, little one?" Carla nodded vigorously. "Each person has different colors depending on how they feel. My mum is always green and gold because she is strong and kind. Isabel is blue and silver because she is smart but sad. And Uncle Edward—" She looked at him with her big, honest eyes. "Uncle Edward is dark purple with white dots, like the sky during a storm." Edward felt tears welling up again. Even a special child could see the emotional storm he carried inside his chest. "And Helen, what colors does she have now?" "Now she is golden yellow, with green edges, like the sun rising behind the trees," Carla replied with disarming naturalness. "Very different from when I saw her before, all grey and dark blue." Akiko knelt beside Carla, her small, calloused hands gently touching the girl's face. "You are very special, child. Your friend Helen talks about you all the time. She says that a special little girl leaves beautiful drawings for her, and that helps her remember that there are still pure people in the world." Isabel wiped the tears running down her cheeks. "Mrs. Akiko, when can we see her? When will she allow us to get close?" The Japanese woman slowly stood up, heading to a small drawer in a wooden table. From there, she took out a sealed envelope. "She left this for me 2 weeks ago, said that if the family came looking for her, I should give it to them." She extended the envelope to Edward, her hands trembling slightly. "She also said she was almost ready to come back, but she needed to be sure that you would be able to accept the new Helen. A woman who sometimes forgets small things, who needs patience and understanding." Edward took the envelope with reverence, as if it were a sacred treasure. On the back, he immediately recognized Helen's delicate handwriting. "To my beloved family, when you are ready to meet who I have become." "She is preparing to come back," he whispered, his voice laden with a hope he hadn't dared to feel in 2 long years. Akiko nodded, smiling for the first time since she arrived. She is healing, Mr. Edward, and from what I can see, you are also ready to heal alongside her. The silence in the studio was almost palpable as Edward contemplated the envelope in his hands. His fingers delicately traced the familiar handwriting of Helen, each curve of the letters awakening memories he had tried to bury, along with his pain. Isabel remained by his side, her green eyes fixed on the letter as if it could reveal all the mysteries of the universe, while Constance held Carla close to her body, instinctively protecting her daughter from the emotional intensity that hung in the air. Akiko moved silently around the studio, organizing brushes and closing paint tubes with the methodical precision of someone who had witnessed many human transformations over decades of life. The scent of incense emanating from her clothes mixed with the familiar smell of oil paint and solvent, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously strange and comforting. "Dad," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling, "are you going to open the letter now?" Edward took a deep breath, his lungs filling with air, heavy with memories and possibilities. "Yes, my daughter. It's time for us to understand everything." His hands trembled slightly as he carefully broke the seal of the envelope, taking care not to damage the paper that Helen had touched with her own hands. Inside the envelope were 2 sheets of stationery written in the delicate handwriting he knew so well. Edward unfolded the sheets slowly, as if he were handling sacred relics. As he began to read, his voice emerged like a hoarse whisper. "My beloved Edward, my dear Isabel, and all those who have been part of our family history, if you are reading this letter, it means you have finally found my refuge. It means that Carla, my little keeper of secrets, has fulfilled her promise to protect our special correspondence until the right moment arrived. It means you are ready to learn the truth about what happened to me, and perhaps if you have enough courage, you are ready to accept me as I am now. First, I need you to know that my death was not an abandonment. It was an act of desperate love. In the months leading up to that terrible night on the road, I was losing pieces of myself daily. I would wake up entire mornings, not recognizing my own reflection in the mirror. I would look at Isabel playing the piano, and for a few terrifying moments could not remember her name. I would see Edward coming home from work and felt as if I were watching a kind stranger sharing my house. The accident on the stairs of the charity institution in Springfield happened in March, but I hid it from you because I did not want to cause unnecessary worry. The local hospital doctor said I had suffered a mild concussion and that the symptoms would pass in a few weeks. He was wrong. The symptoms intensified, and along with them came a paralyzing fear that you would realize I was no longer the Helen you knew and loved. I began to forget important things. Isabel's 15th birthday went unnoticed until she reminded me herself that morning. I forgot our Sunday tradition of visiting your mother, Edward, and only remembered when you questioned my absence. But what terrified me the most were the moments when I looked at both of you and felt as if I were playing a role in a play for which I had forgotten the script. Edward stopped reading, his hands trembling so much that the words began to blur before his eyes. Isabel gently touched his arm, offering silent support for him to continue. On the night of the accident, I had spent the entire day trying to remember where I had kept our wedding photo album. I searched the whole house, but it was as if my own memory had been rearranged by strange hands. When I finally found the album, I spent hours looking at the photos, desperately trying to reconnect with that happy woman smiling next to the man she loved. It was then that I made a decision that I know must have caused unimaginable pain to you. I decided to disappear until I could find myself again. The accident was real, Edward. I truly lost control of the car in the rain. I really fell into the river. But when I managed to get out of the water, cold and terrified, I saw an opportunity to start over without causing more confusion for our family. I walked along the wet road for hours until I reached a small town where no one knew me. There, a Japanese family who ran a simple inn took me in. They were the ones who took me to Akiko at the flea market weeks later. Akiko became more than an employer. She became my guide to rediscovering who I really am beneath the mental confusion. Isabel wiped away a tear that was rolling down her cheek. Dad, she was protecting us. All along she was trying to protect us. Edward nodded, unable to speak, and continued reading with an increasingly emotional voice. In the last 8 months, working with crafts and painting, helping underprivileged children in the city parks, my memory has gradually returned. Not completely. There are still gaps that may never be filled, but enough for me to know who I am and how much I love you. I discovered that my soul heals when I create beauty with my hands. I discovered that my heart rebuilds when I help children who have nothing but hope. And I discovered that my mind organizes itself when I have a purpose greater than my own suffering. Isabel, my precious daughter, I know you have grown so much during my absence. I know you have taken on responsibilities you should not have to bear at such a young age. I want you to know that every drawing I left for Carla was a way to touch your life from afar, to continue being your mother even, when I could not be physically present. Your piano performances at school were broadcast on local radio a few times, and I always tuned in to hear your music. It is the soundtrack of my healing. Edward, my eternal love, I know you visited my grave every Saturday with white roses. I know because many times I watched from afar, hidden among the trees of the cemetery, seeing you cry and whisper words of love that reached my heart like balm. Your tears were mine too, but they were necessary. You needed to process the loss of the Helen, who was to be able to accept the Helen I have become. Constance dried her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform, clearly moved by the intensity of the confession. Carla remained quiet, but her eyes shone with understanding that went beyond her age. I know you have questions that this letter cannot fully answer. I know you need to see me, touch me, be sure that I am real and not a ghost created by the despair of longing. So, if you still want to meet me, not as the perfect Helen I may never have been, but as the imperfect Helen I have become, meet me tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the square in front of St. Mary's Church. I will be dressed simply, probably helping the street children who gather there every afternoon to share food and stories. If you decide not to show up, I will understand. If you decide to come, know that the woman you find may not be exactly the one you lost, but she is a woman who has learned to love herself again, and who, because of that, has even more love to offer. Akiko took care of me, like a daughter during these months. Constance and Carla were my guardian angels, protecting my secrets and keeping our connection alive through innocent drawings. You all gave me time to heal, and now I am ready to be part of a family again. Not as the controlling matriarch I may have been, but as a woman who has learned the value of humility and acceptance. Edward, if you still want me as your wife, know that we may need to rebuild our intimacy slowly. My memory of many intimate moments is still fragmented, and I need patience to reconnect with the woman you fell in love with. Isabel, if you still want me as your mother, know that I may need your help to remember family traditions that have been lost in the confusion of my mind. But I promise that the love I feel for you has not diminished. It has only transformed into a more conscious and grateful form. With all my love and hope, Helen P.S. Carla, my little artist, thank you for keeping our colorful secrets. You were my connection to joy when I had forgotten how to smile. Edward carefully folded the letter, his hands trembling with the intensity of the emotions that overwhelmed him. The studio had filled with a different energy. no longer one of mystery and discovery, but of possibility and redemption. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice filled with hope, "tomorrow we will meet Helen." The night that followed the discovery of the letter was the longest of Edward's life. Lying in his king-size bed in the silent mansion on Upper East Side, he contemplated the ornate ceiling while Helen's words echoed incessantly in his mind. The letter lay carefully folded on the bedside table next to the photo. He had always kept there a portrait of Helen smiling in the garden of their home, taken just 3 months before the accident. Isabel also couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, she appeared at her father's bedroom door, wearing the flannel pajamas that Helen had sewn for her 2 years ago, with little flowers hand-stitched. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, tears of relief, fear, longing, and a cautious hope she hadn't dared to feel since her mother's death. "Dad," she murmured, approaching the bed, "can I stay here tonight? I can't stop thinking about what it will be like to see her tomorrow." Edward moved to the side, making space for his daughter as he used to when she was a child having nightmares. Isabel lay down beside him, and for a few moments they remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. "Do you think she will look very different?" Isabel finally asked, her voice small in the darkness of the room. Edward wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders, feeling how much she had grown during these 2 difficult years. "Physically, probably, but Isabel, what makes me more nervous is not how she will look, but whether we will still know how to be a family. We spent 2 years learning to live without her. Now we need to relearn how to live with her." Isabel snuggled closer to her father, finding comfort in the familiar warmth. "I keep playing the piano every night because I imagined that somehow she could hear me. Now to find out that she really was listening through the radio broadcasts." Her voice faltered, choked by emotion. "She always was like that, sweetheart. Always found ways to be present even when she seemed absent." Edward paused, remembering details that now took on new meaning. "In the last months before the accident, I noticed that she sometimes seemed distant, but I thought it was just worries about her charity work. I never imagined she was battling her own mind." Isabel turned to look at him in the dim light of the room. "Dad, do you forgive her for letting us believe she was dead for so long?" Edward was silent for a long moment, processing the question he had asked himself hundreds of times in the last hours. "You know, Isabel, during these 2 years I carried terrible guilt. I thought I had failed as a husband, that I should have seen the signs, that I could have prevented the accident. Now to discover that she was protecting us, that she was fighting something she didn't even fully understand." He took a deep breath. "There is nothing to forgive. There is only much to rebuild." On the other side of the city, in a small apartment on the east side, Constance was also having a sleepless night. Sitting at the kitchen table, she watched Carla sleep soundly on the sofa bed they shared in the one-bedroom apartment. The girl had insisted on sleeping in the living room, saying she needed to be near the window to watch the colors of the night, yet another of her peculiarities that Constance didn't fully understand, but deeply respected. Constance held a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, her thoughts constantly returning to Helen. Throughout these months, she had suspected that something was different. Little details that an observant housekeeper would notice. Clothes that appeared washed and ironed on the clothesline without her having touched them. Food that disappeared from the fridge in amounts that didn't match the family's consumption. Gardens that seemed to have been tended by experienced hands during her days off. "I should have said something," she murmured to herself, guilt gnawing at her stomach. "I should have told Mr. Edward about my suspicions." Carla stirred on the sofa bed, murmuring something incomprehensible in her sleep. Constance got up to cover her better, and as she leaned over her daughter, she clearly heard the words she was whispering. The colors are getting brighter. The sad lady is turning golden. At the flea market, Akiko was also awake in her small apartment above the jewelry store. She had called Helen as soon as the Montgomery family left the studio, recounting everything that had happened. The conversation had been brief but emotionally charged. "Did they read the letter?" Helen had asked, her voice anxious, on the other end of the line. "Yes, dear. They will be at the park tomorrow. All of them." There was a long silence before Helen replied. "Akiko-san, what if they look at me and realize I'm not the same person anymore? What if the woman I've become isn't enough for them?" Akiko smiled, even knowing Helen couldn't see her. "My dear child, you've spent 8 months rebuilding yourself. They've spent 2 years rebuilding themselves too. Tomorrow won't be about finding the people you once were. It will be about discovering who you've become." Now, preparing green tea in her tiny kitchen, Akiko reflected on the months she had spent watching Helen gradually heal. It had been a delicate process, like watching a wounded flower slowly regain its ability to bloom. In the early months, Helen could barely talk about her family without panicking, confusing names and dates, mixing memories in sequences that made no sense. Working with her hands had been crucial to her recovery. Akiko had taught her traditional Japanese crafting techniques, origami, pottery, watercolor painting, and watched in fascination as each creative activity seemed to reconnect Helen with lost parts of her personality. When she painted, her memory flowed more clearly. When she worked with clay, her hands remembered movements her mind had forgotten. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Helen, calling from the payphone near the simple boarding house where she lived. "Akiko-san, I can't sleep. I'm scared." "What are you scared of, dear?" "That when they see me tomorrow, they'll realize the Helen they loved really died in that accident. That the woman I am now is a stranger wearing her face." Akiko set her teacup on the table, carefully choosing her words. "Helen-chan, do you remember the first time you came to my stall at the flea market?" "I vaguely remember. I was lost, looking for work. You were wearing expensive but worn clothes, had well-groomed hair but broken nails. You looked like a wealthy person who had lost everything, but you also seemed like someone who had found something more important than wealth." Helen was silent on the other end of the line. "Do you know what I saw in you that day?" Akiko continued. "I saw a woman brave enough to start over when she realized the life she had wasn't working. I saw a mother who loved her family so much she was willing to sacrifice herself to spare them pain. And I saw an artist who had forgotten how to create, but was desperately trying to remember. And now? What do you see now?" Akiko smiled, looking out the window at the lights of the city that never sleeps. "Now I see a woman who remembers how to create beauty, a mother who never stopped loving even when she forgot how to show it, and a wife who is ready to relearn what it means to be part of a family." Helen sighed deeply. "Thank you, Akiko-san, for everything. Get some sleep, dear. Tomorrow you will need all your strength, and remember, they are not coming to judge you, they are coming to reconnect with you." When the phone was hung up, Akiko remained seated in her kitchen, watching the first lights of dawn paint the horizon in gold and pink. In a few hours, a family that had been shattered by tragedy would have the opportunity to rebuild through mutual forgiveness and acceptance. It was the kind of story she had seen repeat itself many times over her 6 decades of life. Lost people finding each other again, not as they were, but as they had become through their solitary journeys of healing. She just hoped everyone would have enough courage to embrace the second chance fate was offering. The park in front of St. Mary's Church was busier than usual that Friday afternoon. The winter sun filtered through the maple trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced on the cobblestone ground. Street vendors offered sweet popcorn and cotton candy to the children playing on the rusty swings, while elderly people occupied the wooden benches, playing chess and dominoes. Edward arrived at 4:45 in the afternoon, accompanied by Isabel, who wore the navy blue dress that Helen had chosen for her on her last birthday before the accident. His hands trembled slightly as he held a small bouquet of white orchids, the same flowers he took to the cemetery every Saturday, but this time with a completely different purpose. Constance and Carla were already waiting near the central gazebo of the park. The girl wore her prettiest yellow dress, the same one she had worn for her communion a few months ago, and carried a new sketchbook where she had drawn a portrait of the Montgomery family together, especially for this day. Her eyes sparkled with contained excitement as she watched each person passing by, searching for the golden hues she associated with Helen. "Mr. Edward," Constance said as they approached. "I haven't seen her yet, but Carla says she always arrives promptly at 5. Edward checked his wristwatch, a Rolex that Helen had gifted him for his 40th birthday. It was 4:58. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it pulsing in his ears, partially drowning out the sounds of the busy park. Isabel held his hand tightly, her fingers cold and slightly trembling. "Dad, what if she changed her mind? What if she saw us coming and decided she's not ready?" "Then we will wait," Edward replied, his voice firmer than his feelings. "We will wait as long as it takes." At 5 o'clock sharp, Carla suddenly pointed to the other side of the park, her eyes lighting up like 2 stars. "There, the golden hues are coming." Edward followed the direction of the little girl's finger and felt as if the world stopped spinning. As she walked slowly among the trees, he instantly recognized a woman, despite the obvious changes. Helen wore faded jeans, a simple white cotton shirt, and worn sneakers. Her hair, once long and light brown, was now short and dyed a darker brown, cut in a practical and functional style. She looked thinner, more angular, but there was something in her posture that radiated a serenity Edward had never seen before. She carried a patterned fabric bag full of what seemed to be handmade toys and children's books. 3 street children, aged between 7 and 10, walked beside her, chatting animatedly as she handed out sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. Her movements were gentle and deliberate, and when she smiled at the children, Edward could see glimpses of the woman he had fallen in love with 15 years ago. Helen stopped when she noticed the group waiting for her near the gazebo. For a moment that felt like an eternity, she and Edward looked at each other, across the 20 meters that separated them. Then she said something softly to the children accompanying her, handed them the bag of toys, and began to walk slowly toward the family. With each step she took, Edward could see details that confirmed this was indeed his Helen, but also a transformed Helen. She walked with more careful steps, as if she were constantly orienting herself in space. Her hands, once always adorned with the gold rings he had chosen, now wore only a simple bracelet of colorful beads, but her eyes, those honey-colored eyes he knew by heart, shone with a light he hadn't seen in a long time. When she finally stopped just 2 meters away, the silence that settled was heavy with 2 years of pain, longing, confusion, and hope. Helen looked first at Edward, then at Isabel, and finally at Constance and Carla, her eyes filling with tears she didn't try to hide. "Hello," she said, her voice exactly as Edward remembered, but laden with a hesitation that was new. "Thank you for coming." Isabel was the first to move. With a choked sob, she ran the 2 meters that separated her from her mother and threw herself into her arms. Helen hugged her tightly, her eyes closing as she deeply inhaled the familiar scent of her daughter's hair. "My girl," Helen murmured, her voice breaking with emotion. "My precious girl, you've grown so much. God, how you've grown." "Mummy," cried Isabel against her mother's shoulder. "I missed you so much. So much." Edward watched the scene through a haze of tears, his feet seeming to be glued to the ground by invisible strings. This was Helen, his Helen, but at the same time she was a stranger he needed to get to know again. The woman holding Isabel was physically more delicate, but she also radiated an inner strength he didn't remember seeing before. Helen lifted her eyes over Isabel's head and looked directly at him. "Edward," she said softly, and the simple sound of his name on her lips made him feel as if he were crumbling and rebuilding himself simultaneously. "Helen!" he managed to say, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "My God, Helen!" She gently pulled away from Isabel but kept one arm around her daughter's waist, as if she needed the physical contact to stay grounded. I know I have a lot to explain. I know I caused unimaginable pain. I know that—" "No," Edward interrupted, finally finding the strength to move. He approached slowly, as if he were nearing an injured animal that might flee if he made any sudden movements. "You don't need to explain now. You just need to be here." When he stopped an arm's length away from her, Edward extended the white orchids he had brought. "I brought these for you, not for a grave, but for the living woman who never stopped loving." Helen took the flowers with trembling hands, bringing them to her face, to inhale their delicate fragrance. "White orchids," she murmured, a sad smile curving her lips. "You still remember." "I remember everything about you," Edward said, his voice gaining strength. "Including that you've always been brave enough to do what you thought was right, even when it hurt." Carla approached timidly, her sketchbook pressed against her chest. "Mrs. Helen," she said in her clear child's voice, "I drew your family all together again. Do you want to see?" Helen knelt to be at the girl's height, her eyes filling with tenderness. "Of course I want to see, my little artist. You took very good care of our secrets, didn't you?" Carla opened the sketchbook, revealing a colorful drawing where 4 figures were holding hands in a flower-filled park. "Look, I drew everyone in happy colors. Mr. Edward isn't dark purple anymore. Now he's light blue like the sky after the rain." Helen looked at the drawing and then at Edward, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, understanding she was asking for permission to touch him, to confirm he was real. Slowly, Helen reached out and touched Edward's face, her fingers tracing the lines that worry and pain had etched into his features during the 2 years of absence. "You have new wrinkles," she observed softly. "You have new hair," he replied, covering her hand with his. "I have many new things," Helen said, her voice laden with multiple meanings. "Some broken things I'm learning to fix. Some lost things I may never find again, and some discovered things I never knew existed." Isabel approached again, reluctant to step away from her mother now that she had found her. "Mommy, you will come home with us?" Helen hesitated, looking at each of them. "Isabel, my dear, I don't know if the woman I am now can simply return to the life we had before. So much has changed. I have changed." Edward felt a tightness in his chest but forced himself to keep his voice calm. "Then we will discover a new way to be a family, a way that works for who you have become and for who we have become as well." Helen looked at him in surprise, as if she hadn't expected such understanding. "Edward, do you understand that sometimes I still forget things? That I can look at you in the morning and take a few seconds to remember why you are important to me?" "Then I will remind you," he said simply, "every day if necessary." Constance, who had remained discreetly away to give the family privacy, approached with tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Helen, would you like me to prepare your room at home? Do you want me to leave everything as it was?" Helen stood up and embraced the staff member with genuine affection. "Constance, you and Carla saved my sanity during these months. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me for anything. We are family," replied Constance, her simple words carrying a deep truth. Helen looked around the small circle they had formed in the park, Edward holding the flowers, Isabel radiant with happiness, Carla proudly showing her sketches, Constance smiling through tears. "Family," she repeated softly. "Yes, we are family. Maybe not in the same way we were before, but perhaps in a better way." Edward extended his hand to her, a silent question. Helen looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly intertwined her fingers with his. "Let's go home," she said. "Let's figure out how to rebuild our family, one day at a time." As they walked together through the park toward the car, the sun began to set, painting the sky in golden hues that Carla would surely describe as colors of happiness finally arriving. It was the first step of a long and delicate journey of reconstruction, but for the first time in 2 years, they were all walking in the same direction. The mansion on Fifth Avenue looked different when Helen crossed its main door for the first time in 2 years. She paused in the marble foyer, her eyes slowly scanning the familiar details that now seemed strange. The Austrian crystal chandelier they had bought during their honeymoon in Vienna, the curved staircase with a mahogany railing, the impressionist paintings she had chosen herself to decorate the walls. "Everything seems smaller than I remembered," she murmured, her hands nervously gripping the handles of the small suitcase that contained her few personal belongings from the last 8 months. Edward stood beside her, respecting the space she needed to reorient herself, but ready to offer support if necessary. Isabel, on the other hand, was visibly anxious, wanting to show her mother everything that had changed and everything that had remained the same during her absence. "Mom," said Isabel, taking Helen's free hand, "do you want to see my room? I changed a few things, but I kept the picture of us that you always said was your favorite." Helen smiled, gently squeezing her daughter's hand. "Of course, my dear, but can we go slowly? I'm still getting used to being back." Constance watched the discreet scene from the top of the stairs, where she had been organizing the master bedroom for Helen's return. She had spent the entire morning changing the sheets, placing fresh white orchids in the vase, on the dresser, and delicately removing the mourning portraits that Edward had scattered throughout the house in the months following the memorial. Now it was necessary to transform a mausoleum of memories back into a living home. "Constance," called Helen, noticing the staff member at the top of the stairs, "could you please come down? I want to talk to you." When Constance came down, Helen embraced her tightly, whispering, "Thank you for taking care of my family while I couldn't. Mrs. Helen, you don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would do." "No," Helen said firmly, stepping back to look directly into the staff member's eyes. "You did much more than that. You kept this house running, took care of Edward and Isabel, and on top of that, protected Carla's secrets. That's not just anyone. That's family." Edward watched the interaction with a mix of gratitude and melancholy. During Helen's 2 years away, Constance had truly become more than a staff member. She had become the emotional anchor that held the house together. Now it would be necessary to carefully redefine all those roles. "Helen," he said softly, "would you like to go upstairs to see our room? Or would you prefer we prepare one of the guest rooms for you until you feel more comfortable?" Helen hesitated, biting her lower lip, a gesture Edward recognized as a sign of anxiety. "Edward, I need to be honest about one thing. Sometimes, when I wake up, it takes me a few minutes to remember where I am and why I'm there. During those moments, familiar people can seem strange to me. I don't want you to wake up one day and I look at you as if you were an intruder." The brutal honesty of the confession hit Edward like a punch, but he maintained a serene expression. "Then let's take it slow. Maybe you can stay in the guest room on the 2nd floor for now, until you feel ready to share the master bedroom again." Isabel furrowed her brow, clearly confused. "But Dad, you're married. Why would Mom stay in a separate room?" Helen knelt in front of her daughter, holding her small hands. "Isabel, dear, do you remember when you broke your arm at the park last year? And even after the cast was removed, it took weeks for you to use your arm normally again?" "I remember. It hurt, and I was scared to use my full strength. It's kind of like how I feel now. My mind was broken." For a while, and even though she was now healed, Helen still needed time to get used to sharing a room with her father again. Isabel nodded slowly, showing a maturity beyond her 16 years. "So you'll stay in the blue room for now? It has the best view of the garden." "The blue room would be perfect," agreed Helen, relieved by her daughter's understanding. In the days that followed, the family began the delicate process of relearning to live together. Helen woke up early, often before dawn, and Edward frequently found her sitting in the garden, painting or simply watching the sunrise. She had brought some of her art supplies from her studio in the West Side and slowly began to transform the old plant greenhouse into a sort of makeshift studio. "Can I stay here with you?" Edward asked one of those mornings, finding Helen painting a delicate watercolor of the garden still covered in morning dew. "Of course," she replied, not lifting her eyes from the canvas, "but you don't need to talk. Sometimes I just like having quiet company." Edward sat in a nearby wicker chair, watching Helen's delicate hands move with precision over the paper. It was mesmerizing to see her create beauty, and he realized he had forgotten how completely she became absorbed in her artistic projects. During the early years of their marriage, he used to complain that she spent too much time painting. Now he clearly saw that art was not just a hobby for Helen. It was her way of processing the world and her emotions. "Edward," she said softly after nearly an hour of companionable silence, "can I ask you a difficult question?" "Of course." "During these 2 years, did you get involved with anyone else? Romantically, I mean." Edward felt his stomach tighten. He had prepared himself for this question, knowing it would eventually come. "There were a few attempts," he admitted honestly. "Work colleagues who tried to console me, widows that friends tried to introduce me to. But I never managed. I could never connect with anyone. It was as if my heart was buried along with you." Helen stopped painting and looked directly at him. "And now? Finding out that I was alive, do you feel angry for having wasted 2 years of your life waiting for a ghost?" "Helen," Edward said, rising from the chair and kneeling beside her, "you were not a ghost. You were a woman struggling to heal. And I didn't waste 2 years. I used them to learn to appreciate what we had in a way that I might never have valued if I hadn't lost it." Isabel was also going through her own process of readjustment. In the first nights after Helen's return, she had nightmares where her mother disappeared again. Simply dissolving into thin air, she began to compulsively check if Helen was still home, knocking on the blue room door several times during the night to make sure she hadn't left again. "Isabel," Helen said on one of those occasions, opening the door after the 3rd check of the night, "would you like to sleep here with me tonight? Maybe it will help you rest better." Isabel nodded vigorously and soon found herself lying next to her mother on the single bed in the guest room, listening to Helen softly hum the same lullabies she used to sing when Isabel was little. It was comforting to discover that some memories remained intact in Helen's wounded mind. "Mommy," Isabel whispered in the dark, "do you remember when we used to have picnics in the garden on Sundays? You always made sandwiches cut into star shapes." Helen was silent for a moment, and Isabel feared she had mentioned a memory that had been lost. But then Helen replied, "I vaguely remember the picnics, but I don't remember the star-shaped sandwiches. Could you teach me how to make them?" "Of course," exclaimed Isabel, relieved. "Tomorrow is Sunday. We can have a picnic and I'll show you." Downstairs, Edward stayed awake, In his office, shuffling through work papers without really reading them, his mind was completely occupied processing the new reality of his life. Helen was alive, she was home, but she was simultaneously the woman he had loved for 15 years and a stranger he needed to get to know again. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Dr. Mark Wilson, psychiatrist and old family friend, returning the call Edward had made earlier. "Edward, you said Helen is back? How so?" Edward briefly explained the extraordinary situation, omitting some more intimate details, but giving the doctor enough information for a preliminary assessment. "Edward," Dr. Wilson said after hearing everything, "what you're describing sounds like partial retrograde amnesia, possibly caused by head trauma. It's a treatable condition, but it requires patience and specialized therapy. Helen should be examined as soon as possible." How do I suggest this to her without making it seem like I'm questioning her mental sanity? Be direct. Tell her you want to understand her condition better so you can support her properly. If she really experienced head trauma, there are therapies that can significantly help recover lost memories. After hanging up the phone, Edward slowly climbed the stairs, stopping in front of the blue room door. He could hear the muffled voices of Helen and Isabel talking softly, and for the first time in 2 years, the house truly felt like a home again. It was just the beginning of a long and complex journey of family healing, but for the first time, Edward felt hopeful that they could rebuild their family on stronger foundations than before. 3 weeks after Helen's return, the family had established a delicate but functional routine. Edward worked part-time to spend more time at home. Isabel had resumed her piano lessons with renewed enthusiasm, and Helen dedicated her mornings to painting and her afternoons to helping Constance with simple household tasks, a way to reconnect with the rhythms of the house without overwhelming herself. It was during one of those afternoons, while they were organizing the attic that had previously served as Helen's studio, the first major disturbing discovery occurred. Isabel was sorting through old canvases when she found a wooden box hidden behind a stack of framed paintings. "Mom," she called, "what's in this box? It has a small lock, but it looks like it hasn't been opened in a long time." Helen approached, wiping her paint-stained hands on an old rag. When she saw the box, her face visibly paled, and she had to lean on the nearby table to avoid staggering. I remember this box," she murmured, her voice trembling, "but I don't remember why I hid it here or what's inside." "Do you want me to call Dad to help open it?" Isabel asked, noticing her mother's discomfort. "No," Helen said quickly, then corrected herself with a softer voice. "I mean, let's see if I can remember where I stored the key first. Maybe that will help me recall the memory associated with it." Helen began rummaging through drawers and shelves with growing urgency, her hands trembling slightly. It was as if the sight of the box had awakened some primal instinct, telling her that there was something important, possibly disturbing inside it. "Here!" she exclaimed finally, pulling out a small key from inside a decorative vase on a high shelf. "I always hid important keys in high places." When Helen inserted the key into the lock and the box opened with a soft click, she and Isabel were confronted with contents that left them completely confused. There were dozens of medical photographs, X-rays, CT scans, and MRIs of a brain. Along with the images were medical reports dated 6 months before the accident, all in Helen's name, but with a different address from the family home. "My God," Helen whispered, picking up one of the reports with trembling hands. "I was secretly undergoing neurological exams. Why? Why would I hide this?" Isabel read over her mother's shoulder, her expression growing increasingly worried. "Mum, this report here talks about injuries consistent with moderate head trauma and urgent recommendation for neurological follow-up. Do you remember consulting this doctor?" Helen shook, Her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I don't remember any of this, but if I was hiding neurological exams from the family, there must have been a very serious reason. It was at that moment that Edward appeared in the attic, drawn by their agitated voices. When he saw the two women bent over the scattered medical documents, his expression changed immediately. "What did you find?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Helen extended one of the reports to him, her hands visibly trembling. "Edward, I was undergoing neurological exams months before the accident, and I hid everything from you. I can't remember why, but it must have been something serious." Edward read the report in silence, his expression becoming increasingly tense. The document spoke of structural changes resulting from head trauma, possible development of amnesic symptoms, and need for close family follow-up to monitor behavioral changes. "Helen," he said calmly, though his voice carried a noticeable tension, "this report is from Dr. Robert Smith at General Hospital. Do you remember him?" "No," Helen replied, frustration evident in her voice. "I don't remember anything about these exams. It's like there's a black hole in my memory covering exactly this period." Isabel picked up another document from the box, a handwritten letter clearly written by Helen herself, but addressed to herself. "Mom, look at this. It's a letter you wrote to yourself." Helen took the letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "Helen, if you are reading this, it means your memory is worsening, and you need to remember some important things. The tests confirmed that the accident at the charity organization caused more serious damage than we initially thought. Dr. Smith said you may start forgetting familiar faces, recent events, and even entire periods of your life. You decided to hide this from the family because you didn't want Edward to cancel his work commitments to take care of you. Nor did you want Isabel to worry during the important years of her adolescence. You believe you can handle this on your own, at least for now. But if you are reading this, it may be that for now has come to an end. The medications are in the bottom drawer of your dresser, hidden behind the winter socks. Dr. Smith's number is written inside your planner on the December page, disguised as a manicure appointment. If things get too bad, you plan to tell Edward everything on a special occasion, maybe on your wedding anniversary in September. But if your mind is too confused by then, this letter should serve as a reminder that you need professional medical help. You love your family too much to become a burden to them, but perhaps loving your family means allowing them to help you, even when it scares you. With love and hope for healing, Helen, who still remembers who she is." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Edward sat heavily in an old chair, the implications of the letter hitting him like an avalanche. Helen had been dealing with a serious neurological condition for months, alone, protecting the family from a truth that was consuming her from within. "September," Edward murmured. "Our wedding anniversary is in September. You were planning to tell me on our anniversary, but the accident happened in August." Isabel moved closer to her mother, holding her hands tightly. "Mum, you were protecting us. Even when your own mind was unraveling, you were trying to protect us." Helen broke down in tears, all the pressure of the past months finally finding a release. "I vaguely remember being afraid, very afraid, of waking up one day and not recognizing you, of becoming a stranger in my own life. Then I decided that if this were to happen, it would be better to disappear before you witnessed my deterioration." Edward stood up and hugged her tightly, finally fully understanding the magnitude of the sacrifice that Helen had made. "You didn't disappear to abandon us," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You disappeared to spare us from seeing you suffer." "But I was wrong," sobbed Helen against his chest. "I should have told you. I should have let you help me." "Yes, you should have," Edward gently agreed. "But now we know the truth. Now we can face this together, the way it always should have been." Isabel embraced both of them, forming a tight circle of mutual support. "Let's see Dr. Wilson tomorrow. We'll find out what your real condition is now and how we can help your memory improve." "And what if we find out that my condition is degenerative?" Helen asked, voicing the fear they all carried. "What if I keep forgetting important things? What if one day I forget you completely?" Edward held her face between his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Then we will remind you who you are every day. We will fill this house with photographs, letters, videos, everything that can help your memory. And even if the day comes when you forget us completely, we will never forget you." Constance appeared at the attic door, drawn by the sound of crying. When she saw the family embraced and surrounded by scattered medical documents, she immediately understood that something significant had been discovered. "Mr. Edward, can I help with anything?" she asked gently. "Constance," said Helen, pulling slightly away from the family embrace, "did you notice anything strange about my behavior in the months before the accident? Any signs that I was forgetting things?" Constance hesitated, clearly uncomfortable recalling painful memories. "Well, Mrs. Helen, you started leaving little notes all around the house, reminders about simple things, where to keep the keys, when Isabel's birthday was, what Mr. Edward's phone number was. I thought you were just stressed with the charity work." "Little notes," Helen repeated, a light of recognition appearing in her eyes. "Yes, I vaguely remember writing little notes. It was my way of compensating for my failing memory." Edward realized that in the last years of their marriage, he had interpreted Helen's increasing distraction as a lack of interest in the family, when in fact she had been desperately struggling to keep her mind functioning. The guilt he had carried for 2 years for being an inadequate husband transformed into a different guilt, the guilt of not having noticed his wife's silent suffering. "Tomorrow," he said with determination, "tomorrow we will start seeking real answers. We will see Dr. Wilson, we will understand exactly what your condition is, and we will create a plan for your complete recovery." Helen nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes, no more secrets, no more trying to protect you by hiding the truth. From now on, we face everything together." Isabel took her mother's and father's hands, uniting the three in a human chain of support. "Together," she agreed, "no matter what we discover, we face it together." It was the end of secrets and the beginning of a medical journey that would determine not only the extent of Helen's neurological damage, but also the family's ability to adapt to the realities of a condition that could change their lives forever. Dr. Mark Wilson's office at General Hospital was an environment that mixed the necessary clinical coldness with personal touches that made it more welcoming. Diplomas and certificates covered an entire wall, while the other displayed photographs of natural landscapes, an intentional attempt to bring serenity to a space where difficult diagnoses were routinely delivered to desperate families. Edward, Helen and Isabel were sitting in the brown leather chairs in front of the neurologist's desk, all visibly tense. It had taken 2 weeks to secure this appointment, 2 weeks during which Helen had undergone a new battery of tests, high-resolution MRIs, extensive neuropsychological tests and detailed cognitive assessments. Dr. Wilson, a man in his mid-50s with well-groomed grey hair and kind eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses, was carefully organizing the test results on his desk. His expression was serious but not hopeless, which offered some relief to the anxious family. "Helen," he finally said, addressing the patient directly, "first, I want to congratulate you on your courage to return for treatment. I know it must not have been easy to make that decision." Helen nervously intertwined her fingers in her lap. "Dr. Wilson, I don't fully remember our previous meetings. I know I was here because we found the test results at home, but my memory of that time is fragmented." "That is perfectly understandable and, in fact, consistent with your condition," the doctor replied gently. Let me explain exactly what happened to you, and more importantly, what your current situation is. Edward held Helen's hand as Dr. Wilson opened the first folder of test results. Helen suffered what we call a moderate traumatic brain injury during your fall at the charity organization. The impact specifically affected areas of the brain responsible for consolidating recent memories and, to a lesser extent, retrieving existing memories. Isabel leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. Does this mean she will never recover the memories she lost? Not necessarily, Dr. Wilson replied, his voice carrying cautious hope. The good news is that the most recent tests show that the brain injury is stabilized and, in some areas, even shows signs of healing. The human brain has an extraordinary ability to adapt and form new neural connections to compensate for damage. Edward felt a cautious relief spreading through his chest. And the memories she has already recovered during these months, are they permanent? Yes, the doctor confirmed with a smile. The memories that Helena's recovery during her rehabilitation period is real and lasting. Her mind has developed very effective compensatory strategies. Artistic work, for example, has been crucial for neural reconnection. Helena lifted her head, a spark of hope appearing in her eyes. So, painting was really helping me heal? Absolutely. Occupational therapy through art is one of the most powerful tools we have for neurological rehabilitation. When you paint, you are literally rebuilding neural pathways that were damaged by trauma. Dr. Wilson stood up and walked over to a three-dimensional model of the human brain on a side table. Look here, he said, pointing to a specific area. The lesion affected primarily the right hippocampus and parts of the temporal lobe. These are the regions responsible for forming new memories and retrieving episodic memories, specific personal life experiences. That explains why I remembered how to paint and how to do basic activities, but forgot specific events like birthdays and important conversations, said Helena, connecting the technical information with her personal experience. Exactly. Your procedural memory, how to perform tasks, has remained largely intact. But your episodic memory, specific recollections of events, has been severely affected, the doctor confirmed. Isabel approached the brain model, studying it with curiosity. Dr. Wilson, is there treatment for this? Something that can help Mom recover more memories? Dr. Wilson returned to his desk and opened another folder. Yes, there are several therapeutic approaches we can implement. First, specialized cognitive behavioral therapy for memory rehabilitation. Second, continued occupational therapy through art. Third, a structured program for reconstructing family memories using photographs, videos, and narratives. Edward straightened in his chair, intrigued. How would this memory reconstruction program work? It's a collaborative process, the doctor explained. The family works together to create a detailed life book, a visual and narrative timeline of Helena's important life moments. Her brain may not recover the original memories, but it can form new memories based on the stories and images you share. Helena wiped away a tear rolling down her cheek. Does that mean I can relearn our family history, even if I don't remember the first time I lived it? Precisely. And here's the most hopeful part, Dr. Wilson said, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. In many cases, when patients start forming these new memories about past events, the process sometimes triggers the spontaneous recovery of fragments of the original memories. Edward felt tears welling up in his eyes. Are you saying there's a real possibility for Helena to recover memories we thought were lost forever? Yes, there is. I can't promise she will recover everything, but based on the significant improvement she has already shown during these 8 months of independent recovery, I am optimistic about her prognosis. Dr. Wilson returned to his chair and leaned forward, adopting a more personal tone. Helena When you first came to see me almost a year ago, you were terrified of what was happening to your mind. I clearly remember you telling me that you would rather disappear than become a burden to your family." Helena nodded, fragmented memories of those difficult days slowly returning. "I vaguely remember that feeling. The fear was overwhelming. And it's understandable. But look where you are now," the doctor said, gesturing to the gathered family. "Helena, you not only survived a significant neurological trauma, but you also developed extraordinary coping strategies. Edward and Isabel, you have shown a resilience and capacity for forgiveness that is rare." Isabel took her mother's hand, intertwining her fingers. "Dr. Wilson, how long will the treatment take?" "Neurological rehabilitation is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. We expect to see significant improvements in the first 6 months of intensive therapy, but progress can continue for years. The most important thing is to maintain realistic expectations and celebrate every small victory." Edward stood up and walked to the office window, which offered a view of the bustling medical center in New York. "Dr. Wilson, during these 2 years, I have carried a terrible guilt for not noticing Helena's suffering. How could a husband not realize that his wife is losing her memory?" Dr. Wilson joined Edward at the window. "Edward, patients with traumatic brain injuries often become masters at masking their symptoms, especially when motivated by love and the desire to protect their family. Helena developed sophisticated compensatory strategies, the notes, the rigid routines, the gradual social isolation. She was literally fighting for her mental sanity every day." Helena approached them, gently touching Edward's arm. "I remember being very afraid that you would notice I was broken. I thought if you knew the extent of the problem, you would cancel all your commitments to take care of me, and I couldn't allow that." "But Helena," Edward said, turning to face her, "taking care of you is my job. It's my privilege. It's what it means to be married." "I know that now," she replied softly. "But at that time, my judgment was compromised by the very condition I was trying to hide. It was a vicious cycle. The more my memory failed, the more desperately I tried to hide it, which in turn created more stress and worsened the symptoms." Dr. Wilson returned to his desk and picked up a colorful brochure. "I have information about support groups for families dealing with traumatic brain injury. You will find that you are not alone on this journey. Many families face similar challenges." Isabel flipped through the brochure, intrigued. "Dr. Wilson, is there anything specific I can do to help Mom? Any activity that is especially useful for memory recovery?" "Music," the doctor replied immediately. "I heard you play the piano, Isabel. Music is one of the most powerful tools for neural recovery. Playing songs that Helena used to love can help awaken associated memories." Helena smiled, a familiar light appearing in her eyes. "I would love to hear you play again, Isabel. I feel something familiar when I hear the piano, even when I can't specifically remember hearing you play before." Edward embraced the two women, feeling for the first time in years a genuine hope about his family's future. "Dr. Wilson, when do we start the treatment?" "We can begin next week. I will refer you to a multidisciplinary team, a neuropsychologist, an art-focused occupational therapist, and a family memory rehabilitation specialist." Helen took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders with renewed determination. "I'm ready. For the first time in a long time, I'm truly ready to fight for my memory, for my family, for our life together." Dr. Wilson smiled, organizing the referral papers on the desk. "Helen, your prognosis is significantly better now than it was a year ago. You have already shown a remarkable capacity for recovery, and now, with the right family support and specialized treatment, I am confident that you can rebuild a rich and fulfilling family life." Edward took the referral papers, feeling as if he were holding tickets to a second chance he never dared to hope for. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you for giving us hope. As they left the office, Helen walked between Edward and Isabel, each holding one of her hands. For the first time in almost 3 years, they faced the future as a united family, armed with knowledge, hope, and a concrete plan for recovery. "Dad," said Isabel as they waited for the elevator, "do you think that when Mum regains more memories, she will remember why she fell in love with you?" Edward laughed, the first genuine laugh he had given in years. "Isabel, if she fell in love with me once, I think I can make her fall in love again. After all, now I know exactly how precious the opportunity to love someone is." Helen squeezed both their hands, smiling through tears of relief. "Maybe I don't remember falling in love with you the first time, Edward, but I can feel it happening again every day." It was the end of a painful journey of discovery and the beginning of a hopeful journey of reconstruction, a family learning that sometimes second chances are even more precious than the first. Please like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's very exciting.